All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 23rd, 1906, Atlanta is in the midst of 4 days of violence that would leave dozens of Black Atlantans dead. These are what are referred to as the Atlanta, quote, race riots, or the Atlanta Massacre, as it is sometimes referred to. It is violence at a time when there was a growing amount of violence in the post-Reconstruction South, and the mix of factors that led to the Atlanta riots was in many ways a familiar script. Accusations of sexual violence, yellow journalism, collaboration between white mobs, government forces, Black businesses targeted. But this is also a very Atlanta story, and so we will get into that first. Here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And a quick shout out to listener Ross, who is from Atlanta, who I've met before, is a great supporter of the show. So thank you, Ross, for suggesting this one. And so, Kellie, I mean, there was a familiar script element to this story, which we will get to, and a tragically familiar script element to this story that we will get to. But there's also a very Atlanta element here, too. And so can you just kind of maybe start there with the picture of what Atlanta is in 1906 and how that sets up this particular moment?
Yeah, Atlanta becomes the new, really, capital of the South. People are flocking to Atlanta to build their businesses, to find economic opportunities or political opportunities. This is also sort of the start of what becomes known as the Great Migration. And so I think people are familiar with Black people moving from the South to the North, but they're also moving from rural areas to urban areas. And so this is where Atlanta really takes off. Its Black population grows exponentially. So they have, a Black population of about 9,000 people at this time, and that number jumps all the way up to 36,000 Black people in the year 1900. And you have, popular, thriving, prosperous Black businesses and communities. And oftentimes that becomes the recipe or the secret ingredient for these mob attacks like we've seen in Tulsa or St. Louis or Chicago, other Black communities that experience these massive mob attacks.
Yeah. It feels to me like in every decade, Atlanta is the, quote unquote, capital of the New South. And it's like at some point you just have to acknowledge it as that. Not new anymore, right? That Atlanta is this major force. But, it's like into the 1990s, you had the conversation about Atlanta as this new cultural defining force. And certainly I think in the 2010s and now,
no other city
like no other
close.
city. Yeah, I think it's like you could make an argument even right now that Atlanta is the most important cultural city in the country. But anyway, it's this interesting thing to think about as a through line for that city.
And at the forefront of a lot of economic shifts. I mean, this is something we'll see going into even the 1950s and 60s. Atlanta gets this reputation as the city too busy to hate because economic and business leaders are not too busy to hate, but they're definitely trying to find ways to make Atlanta seem more welcoming, so that it can attract more business. And so that idea that it's just kind of a little bit ahead of where other economic centers in the South are, I think really give it this reputation as the
much more
capital.
cosmopolitan.
Yeah. So in 1906, there is a gubernatorial election going on at that point between, two white men. But part of that conversation, and I think it sets up the context here, is explicit rhetoric about disenfranchising black voters. So there's a economic element to this, which we can get to, but then there's also very much a post-Reconstruction Jim Crow element of there are too many political rights, and we are going to start to snap back on that.
And the politician that is willing to go the furthest in disenfranchising black people is likely the one that's going to be the most successful. So instead of trying to court black votes, it was how can we shut down black people from voting altogether? And after this massacre, they pretty much achieve just that. Black voting plummets after this and really doesn't recover until the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah.
So this is a moment in which you have a lot of southern cities changing their bylaws, changing their political and social institutions to essentially promote white supremacy wholesale.
It's such an important reminder that, often when we talk in terms of eras of history, we say Reconstruction ended in 1877 and you have this new redemption era. But the process of constructing the Jim Crow state takes decades, right? You have these early laws that are in like the 1870s and 1880s that are beginning to segregate public spaces, but those are happening in piecemeal patchwork ways. You're having violence that is trying to drive down the black vote, but you don't necessarily have the legal structures in place. So this 1906 moment is a reminder that that process of disenfranchisement is one that's still underway and that is being put into effect by violence, in addition to laws.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I was like having trouble in writing the intro to this about like what era do I refer to this as? Like what are these hallmarks of? And yes, it's all a continuum and a fluid. And this isn't exactly what Wikipedia would tell you is post-Reconstruction. This isn't exactly what Wikipedia would tell you is Jim Crow, but it has all of those hallmarks. So yeah, it's like the building blocks of these riots are tragically familiar. So you have, a newly empowered black community attempts to disenfranchise. There's the economic element of black businesses and on the ground economic empowerment that is taking place and that is making a lot of white people very nervous. But then the spark, as is often the case, is these allegations of sexual violence. And that seems, Kellie, to be so often at the heart of the thing that sparks these quote-unquote race riots.
Yeah, these often unsubstantiated rumors that get thrown out there and they stick. And so there were allegations of sexual assault, none of which could be proven. But that's all you need is really the rumor, the idea thrown out there, and then people can pounce. And I think this is where the press comes really into play, because the press really becomes this like clarion call for the mob to attack certain communities, to let people know what's happened or what they believed has happened. And then people use that and take it all the way to the extreme. And to
state the obvious, these are allegations of black men assaulting white women.
Always.
Right?
That's always the narrative is black men sexually assaulting white women, even when there are no, credible allegations or anything of that nature. That is what almost always pops these things off.
Yeah, and that's definitely the story for lynchings as well as these massacres, which is a tell that, individual lynchings and mass murders like this are on the same continuum. They're part of the same project. And in this case, we should add in as causation, Jody, you mentioned the 1906 gubernatorial race. Both of the men who were running, in addition to wanting to strip rights away from black people, they were newspaper editors. So they were part of this press that Kellie is talking about that was printing these lurid accusations and trying to stir people up to act, right, to engage in violence against these Black communities. And it's all part of a big change that's happening in the press. I mean, you'd had newspapers since the start of the United States, but now you have these tabloid newspapers, this kind of yellow journalism that try to outdo one another in order to increase sales by just pushing it further and further and further. So it's telling the most sort of over-the-top stories, spreading the craziest rumors in order to provoke the most violence.
And even sometimes advertising lynchings, saying when a lynching will take place or when a mob attack will take place to put people on notice. We are familiar with Ida B. Wells, but this is where she really uses journalism to push back against this and to say, like, you know, basically I'm calling BS on all of these allegations. You are using these rumors of sexual assault to wreak havoc in the Black community. And she uses journalism to say how many of these cases are unfounded. But by then, you know, the damage is done in the Black community. The destruction has already begun. The businesses are already destroyed. It's churches that are targeted, Black schools, HBCUs at this time that are targeted. Atlanta is known for being a hub of Black education. So you have Spelman, you have Morehouse, you have Clark Atlanta University and Morris Brown College. They're all right there in the heart of downtown Atlanta.
Yeah. And so to lay out some of the beats of this particular incident, right, we have on September 22nd, these newspaper allegations come out. By that very evening, there are thousands of white people going down to some of the predominantly Black neighborhoods, such as Five Points, and starting to, you know, indiscriminately attack Black men, women, and children as they're walking by, attack, as you said, businesses, universities, right? Just to state the obvious here, but if the sort of precipitating allegation is about a couple men committing assault, burning down a Black barbershop doesn't seem to be a commensurate response there. There's something else going on, right? And so we're starting to see this violence and this fever spread in this way. We've talked about this before, but it reminds us so much of, like, for instance, Tulsa or whatever. You know, it's like you have these specific allegations, the specific anger, and then it goes to what was referred to in Tulsa as Black Wall Street, but, you know, goes to this center of economic and community empowerment and attacks that. There's another really interesting moment that has echoes for me of Tulsa and so many of these other stories, which is then in response to this, you know, in the next day or two, a group of Black men and community members start to gather and start to arm themselves to protect. And that gets used as an excuse for even more violence because, oh, look, now they formed a militia. That was actually the precipitating story, I believe, in Tulsa was it was the rumors of violence, Black men then taking up arms to defend their community, and then that being used as an excuse for actual violence because look who's armed themselves, look who is inciting violence.
This is also when W.E.B. Du Bois, who's living in Atlanta, decides to sort of change his tune and pick up arms to defend himself, his wife, his household. It's an incredibly scary time to be living in a city when things like this pop off. And so Black people had to defend themselves, but it's sort of a double-edged sword because the moment you go to defend yourself is also the moment that you make yourself even more vulnerable to additional attack.
Right. And this is also the moment when, you know, it starts off as this white vigilante mob, but then the state militia is called in, and the state militia functionally becomes an extension of the mob in a way. So it comes down in order to restore order, but it is particularly active when Black men began arming themselves. And you end up with mass arrest. You end up with 250 people being arrested, but all of the people who were arrested were African American. There is no record of any sort of arrest or punishment of any of the thousands of white people who engaged in murder over the course of these few days. Yeah.
And we still don't know exactly how many people died or how many people were harmed. You know, those numbers vary from 25 to 100 plus people because the accounting of these types of mobs was never done to keep an accurate record. It was always meant to sort of suppress how many people were killed and the amount of violence or damage that occurred.
Yeah, that's just the fascinating thing about Tulsa, too, right? The death count ranges so widely. And you just, it makes your little antenna go up and you're just like, why is the official count so low and the unofficial count so high?
Right. Well, I mean, it almost reminds me of that episode we did about Attica recently, where you see just the narrative, the seizing of the narrative and the framing of the narrative in the very moments after is so critical. And, who's framing that? And as we've pointed out, the newspapers are such a huge part of this story, and who's going to frame that narrative, who's going to report the quote unquote facts and figures of how many people died and so forth, that, and it just is all an extension from the kind of way it gets cast in those initial moments. As we start to wrap up, though, there are some interesting contours here of kind of the aftermath of this. I mean, it does seem like this was a tragic event. This was early in what we can call an era of racial and political violence. Nevertheless, in Atlanta itself, it does seem like this was a bit of a wake-up call to some communities. And there were what seemed to be genuine conversations between Black and white leaders in the aftermath of this to say, look, how do we prevent something like this from happening again?
Mm-hmm. And I think this is interesting because a few years after this, you get the founding of the NAACP. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who was in Atlanta during this mob, becomes one of the main founders of this organization, as well as other people who had experienced, violent massacres and racism wholesale in their communities. They become charged to create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And right before that, you have the Niagara Movement. That's about the same time, about 1905, 1906 as well. So you have the creation of these Black organizations or organizations for people of color to sort of stop or halt or arrest a lot of this political and economic violence.
Yeah, it's a real pivot point for civil rights leadership for Black rights in the U.S. because so many people, I mean, you've mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, but like Walter White, all of these people who have this as a foundational moment in the way they think about racism and power and how civil rights have to be pursued in the United States, that it's not going to be enough to do kind of a slow, what's often called an accommodationist approach to this, that you're going to need something more dramatic and something more radical because the tools that the other side is willing to use include just incredible amounts of violence.
It's in Atlanta where Booker T. Washington gives his famous Atlanta Compromise speech about accommodation and about sort of like lifting yourselves up by your bootstraps. And I think this is interesting because you have Alonzo Hurden, who's like the first Black millionaire because of his successful barbershops. His businesses are targeted and destroyed. And it just lets you know that you can be a Black millionaire and still not shielded or protected from the mob, and that this accommodationist approach really does not hold up.
Or that may make you more of a target, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Even more so.
One other wrinkle here is that the Atlanta Evening News, which was really the kind of most notorious newspaper at the time that really ratcheted up the tensions ahead of this, stopped publishing in the wake of this. I don't know if people knew the phrase deplatforming at that moment, but, it's a reminder that sometimes, these mouthpieces of hate and division are the thing that actually need to be addressed. And so the Atlanta Evening News did go away after that, not to imply that things were solved or anything. But yes, some real sort of like, as you were saying, pivot and transformational moments here. All right, well, let's leave it there. Thanks again to Ross for suggesting this. Keep the suggestions coming. A couple also on this days. This is September 23rd, 1810. Niki, this was the day of when the Republic of West Florida declared itself independent. We did an episode about that last year. It was very fun.
It still lives on in my heart.
Yeah.
If it was short-lived.
Very short-lived, but they did come up with the most boring flag ever and an unsuccessful attempt to declare themselves an independent republic. Nevertheless, also, West Florida...
Nevertheless,
West Florida in so many ways remains independent, if not on paper, in spirit. So, yes. And then 1952, we've gotten actually a bunch of emails about this. We will find a time to do it. May have to wait a year or we'll find another. But this was the day in which Nixon delivered his famous Checkers speech, which was a speech about campaign finance, but he actually referred to his dog Checkers in it, and basically everyone just picked up on the dog reference and call it.
That's because campaign finance is not the most scintillating of topics. It's just like, here's a picture of a dog.
Yeah. But
early internet.
We will do the checker speech at some point. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.